Three, two, one. Hello, Caroline. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Marty. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. To get us started, for anybody that's not familiar with who you are, can you introduce yourself to us? Tell us a little bit more about what you do.
So yes, I'm Caroline. I live in Lithuania. I've been living here for now 10 years, but I'm French. I was raised in Bordeaux, and around the age of 18 is when I started traveling and for extended periods of time and living abroad whenever I could. And I had always loved languages, but suddenly when I was living abroad, I realized that I could turn my love for languages into my job. And so I started teaching French as a foreign language abroad in different countries while learning the language of the country where I was, which was a fun activity for me. I know it's not for everybody, but for me, it's fascinating. And little by little, I realized that, yeah, I would like to be more professional. So I started studying online. First a bachelor degree and then a master's degree in teaching French as a foreign language. And what I really, really enjoyed about this learning online while teaching and while also learning a language at the same time is how many bridges I could make between concepts, theory, and practice. How I could understand better the classes because I had practical experience of some of the things we were discussing. And when I didn't, then I could start observing my classes and, oh, this I had never noticed, but hey, that's interesting. And then I could try things, suggestions that were in the classes, in the course. I had to write a lot of, essays and things like that. And to have material for my essays, I had to try a lot of things in my classes. So they were like a playground, a sandbox for me to experiment a lot of things. So it was not at all like I'm learning the theory in the book and that's it. It was very interactive and I loved that.
Would you say that gave you a much better base for teaching than, let's say, if we imagine, like you said, somebody that goes to school and gets a degree and so on, and then most of the experience I feel is mostly, like you said, textbook based versus from your experience, it's all about your experiences? Would you say that gives you a better base for becoming a teacher than somebody that just went to school?
It's difficult to say. I think it was more appropriate for me for the kind of learner that I was. I would have been bored with just the theory. And I don't know if I would have lost it until the practical part. So for
That
me, it
makes
was
a lot of
definitely
sense.
better.
Yeah.
But I guess for some people, I talked to quite a lot of people who also studied separately and then had internship because, yeah, when you study to become a language teacher, most of the time you still have internships. So you have that practice. But they said that that practice was really hard at first, very welcome, but like it was the first time they were practicing and they had so much theoretical knowledge that in a way they wanted to do things perfectly from the book, the textbook. Whereas when I started at the beginning, I didn't have any theoretical knowledge. So I was like, okay, let's try things. And I think for some people that would have maybe be much more scary, but for me, it gave me some freedom to not know the theory, to try things and to have the theory come afterwards. So I really think it depends on the personality, but yeah, for some people it would be a great advantage to do it my way.
And can you walk us through a little bit, like you said, that you were teaching French in many different countries? So what were those countries?
So the very first time I taught French was part of my voluntary service, European Voluntary Service, EVS, in Montenegro when I was 19. And that was not what I was supposed to do, but that's what happens when you're a volunteer. You get a lot of opportunities that appear out of nowhere. And that one was so fun. So with one of my fellow volunteers, also French. We were asked to give beginners classes to people who had no previous knowledge of French at all. And it so happened that we knew some two French girls who were giving classes as part of their master's degree internship. So they had some ideas and they gave us some ideas and some material, but we also invented a lot of our own material and methodology. It was very interesting. Now that I look back at it, like it was really interesting what we did. I would never have done things like that if I had studied this before. But I think it was good and creative, and people liked it. But that was just like 2 months, and something that just gave me my first idea that I could do that. And then I came back to France, and I studied media and communication. And somehow, as part of those studies, I could go for 1 year in my case, Scotland, a different country, to be a French assistant. And since I had really liked that experience, and I didn't really like communications and didn't want to work in that field, I thought, okay, I'll try. And I went there for 1 year. And yeah, before I also had an internship as part of that those studies I was doing, and I knew that I didn't want to continue communication, so I went to Alliance Française in Croatia, and I said, okay, I'm gonna have to do some things related to communications. I can work on your websites, I can do this and that, some flyers, but please, can I also teach? And they were very happy because they wanted to have more teachers, and I was doing that, like that was included in the package. So for them, it was very beneficial, and for me as well. So I got some experience teaching in Croatia as well. And then 1 year in Scotland in schools, and that's when I started learning online. And then I went to Madrid and worked at the French Institute, and then Alliance Française, and in some companies through a language school that was finding all those gigs for me. And at the same time, I was studying my master's degree. And as part of my master's degree, I came to Lithuania, where I did my internship. Like I could have a 1 year internship and practice. So I went to 2 schools here, 2 bilingual schools, French, Lithuanian.
And you loved it so much that you decided to stay for 10 years?
And 10 years later, I'm still here, yes.
And what do you most enjoy about Lithuania that maybe you didn't quite find in those other countries, like you said, Croatia and Scotland and Spain? What was missing?
It's a good question that I still struggle to answer.
Okay.
I think I found it quite a bit in Scotland as well. And it's a lot of nature that is very accessible from the city. You don't need to take a car to go to the nature. You can take the bus or even walk and get into some wild place that I really like. And also, I think even though there's many opportunities to interact, be sociable, be extroverted, there's also a lot of respect for introversion, which I like because that helped me realize and connect more to my introverted side. So yes, I think maybe I had the feeling in France or in Spain that what was most valued about me was my extroverted side, that I'm ready to go meet people and to spend as much time as I can with other people, to be always available for relationships. And I love this aspect, but I notice more and more a lot of time to myself as well. And it's very normal and even recognized in Lithuania. And so I really enjoy that.
I suppose you maybe would have enjoyed that about Poland as well.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. And what has been your experience with learning the associated languages of the countries that you've been in? Because obviously you speak French and obviously you speak English, and you speak probably Lithuanian quite well since you've been here for such a long time. And what other languages have you caught on along the way, and how did you deal with them?
So yeah, I was thinking about that. So there are the languages I learned at school or university in a more formal way, and there are the languages I learned because I was in the country, and then I may have taken language classes, but the goal was different. That's because I was in the country. It was very practical. I wanted to be able to communicate with people. And so the languages I learned at school and uni were English and Spanish from quite a young age. And I was even in a school where we could have two first languages, so English and Spanish at the beginning. At least I had as many hours of one as the other. So that helped me have quite a high level of Spanish. When I went to high school, I don't know what level that was, but maybe B1, something like that already. And then I learned Italian for 2 years. That was my way of stopping Latin. The only way I could stop Latin was to learn Italian. So I was like, okay, let's try it. That was much more fun for me. I learned Hebrew for 1 year as well. Yeah, that was just because I was fascinated with the alphabet. Which I don't know. Actually, I don't remember if it's called alphabet in Hebrew as well, because it's a different system. But I was really interested in learning a language that was so different, that was written in a totally different way, and that was fascinating to me. And I also learned Turkish for 1 year, but that was extremely theoretical. That was part of my studies to become a teacher. I had to learn for 1 year a language that was not Indo-European. And the main goal was not to learn that language, but to analyze my learning process, my difficulties, the assumptions I was making, and how I finally realized they were right or wrong, and how I was fixing them and things like that, so that I could be a better teacher for learners that come from Indo-European countries and languages.
That makes a lot of sense. And I do want to dig deeper into that. That's very fascinating that, like you said, you were analyzing your own assumptions. And what did you discover in that process? Was it mostly grammar-based or vocabulary-based, or what did you notice in that experience?
Well, the one thing I remember still, without reading my notes, etc., because it was a bit of a aha moment, was about assumptions. So that's why I spoke about that earlier. So because I had learned some Serbo-Croatian back then, like right now I spoke only about languages I learned at school, but then there's the languages I learned in the countries, Serbo-Croatian, Lithuanian, and a bit of Polish. So I had learned, when I learned Turkish already, some Serbo-Croatian, where just like in Polish and Russian or in Lithuanian, there are 7 cases, declensions, so nouns conjugate just like verbs do, depending on whether something is doing the action, is receiving the action, etc. So in Serbo-Croatian, there are 7 cases. In Turkish, I don't remember how many, but they have the same names, but not the same use exactly. It means that, for example, accusative will not mean exactly the same thing. In some cases, it will be the same, and in some cases, it will be different. And actually, it's the same with all languages that use declensions. The way that declensions, the conjugations for nouns and adjectives are used, are different from one language to another. But you have assumptions because of the languages you know. So I thought that because Croatian worked that way, Turkish worked that way too. And I was so relieved when I saw, they also have declensions. That's going to be easy for me now. I'm just going to have to learn the endings, which in itself is hard, but at least I will know what's behind that from the start. And then I discovered that, oh no, I keep making a mistake and I don't understand why, because it should be accusative here. And I realized that my knowledge of previous languages most of the time could be helpful, but it's very important to realize what the differences are as well. And as a teacher, if you know multiple languages, you can also facilitate the learning process of your students by pointing out the differences, or by helping them to notice those differences on their own, but from an early stage, So yeah, that would be the main learning that I still remember vividly.
Certainly, certainly. And that's a really good point, something that I've noticed in my own experience as well, especially working with a lot of Polish people now more recently. Than I hear what they're saying and I recognize why they're doing it because it's just a literal translation of what they would say in Polish. And then, like you said, those assumptions that we make, which I find very interesting because on the one hand, we obviously realize that it's a different language, and so how could it possibly be the same? But then on the other hand, there are some things that are the same, and there are some things that are similar. So trying to marry both of them and maintain a balance between them is certainly the most difficult thing.
Yeah, but I think it's also so important to find the similarities because that's what can give you momentum. That's what can help you from the start, and that can also motivate you because you're like, oh, I already know so much.
No. And what would you say is your favorite language? Do you have any favorites?
Oh, that's a good question. I would probably still go with English. Like definitely when I was a teenager, that's what I would have said when I was studying in school, like English, Spanish, Italian. I always had a soft spot for English, and I was never able to say why. But that's a language that I like listening to. I liked speaking. I was curious about all languages, but this one, I don't know. I fell in love with it. But now I also really, really, really have a soft spot for Lithuanian. It's just I'm much less comfortable in the language. So it's a language that I speak to a much lower level. And so I cannot, and we will speak about that, I think, more in detail, but I cannot express my personality as much in Lithuanian. I cannot go as deep. I cannot connect as closely to people by diving deep into topics. So I would still say it's English because I get those advantages of being able to, I love the language and I'm able to connect to people that I could never have connected with without knowing the language, either native English speakers or non-native English speakers that we share this language with.
That's the most fascinating part about it, and I often ponder, how incredible it is that I make some sounds and you make some sounds and I understand these sounds that you're making and we can somehow, become friends and make a connection, which is just mind blowing. And I do like the little cliffhanger that you left us on with talking about personalities, and I do want to come back to that in just a moment, but I did want to develop further what you just said, that you don't feel that you can really express yourself and you still like the language, and like you said, you still have that soft spot for English. With your teaching experience, how do you motivate people that are not maybe necessarily motivated by themselves to study a language? Because like you said, if you like it, if you love the way that it sounds, then it's much easier, right? But for anybody listening that maybe has to learn a language, has to learn English, for instance, for work or for study, for something like that, how do you deal with that? Or maybe do you have any tips or any tricks for people that are not necessarily motivated by themselves to study?
I think it's very important to find a motivation. If you don't find anything that motivates you in learning the language, if you just you have to turn this have to into want to. If you don't find anything, then do you really have to learn that language? Do you really have to go through that hard process if you do not enjoy it whatsoever? So if you really have to, because of a goal you have, then think about that goal and think about how you want to reach that goal instead of have to reach that goal. Make it more personal. But yeah, for me, I've never had to learn a language that I didn't want to learn at all. And so it's hard to really think from my experience of cases like that. But I did have some students, for example, when I was teaching in schools. Now I teach mainly students who want to learn French, so it's different. When I was learning at school, a lot of students were there because the school system made them go there, or their parents. So what I found could help motivate them is first to debunk. So we're going into another hanger here, maybe, but debunk the fact that French is hard. So find ways to present things in small, easy ways, and show them that they can understand and that it's actually fun to understand. And for me, the main motivator I found with teenagers and kids was making it fun. And as I love fun, maybe that was my favorite way of going, and there would be other ways of going. Make it super boring and enjoy the suffering. But for me, it was really like, I don't know, turning grammar into a little, how do you call that, discovery? In a thriller, there's the person who try and find the murderer is the detective, a detective game. So often I noticed some students didn't even know that well the grammar of their own language. So I would ask them questions and they would become detectives in their own language. They would get to understand their own language. Then I would introduce how it is in French with similarities and differences, or I would introduce how it is in French and they would have to find the similarities and differences, and we would make a summary of that and then practice with games and a little bit of competition through time. Like it's not so much you encourage competition between students, but just you have a timer so that they're competing against themselves. They're trying to go fast. And I remember what was very moving for me was one time when one student that kept saying, but I don't speak French, I don't understand anything, and I don't manage to make sentences. And we were practicing one structure. And because of the time and getting in the flow, the first rounds were hard. And then at some point, he made a sentence that came out of him on its own, you know? And he was like, how did I do that? Yeah. He was so surprised. So yeah, really, like you have to see if the student works well with this little going out of comfort zone. That timing is, for some students, it would put them in their panic zone, and you don't want to do that. But if it's just a little boost, it can really do wonders. So introduce a bit of gamification, fun, tell stories, make them be a detective, investigate how the language works and things like that, play.
And do you learn that way yourself as well?
I would really love to learn that way, but I didn't find many teachers. It's happened from time to time in by chance I would find a teacher like that. And I think now through internet, we're more able to look for a specific teacher whose teaching style we like. But I haven't been looking for classes now that internet is so developed. So I haven't used that option, but I know that now it's so easy on Instagram, on even just Google, like you can find teachers whose personality or way of teaching you really match with. And then I think that's a great opportunity, because we have all went to language schools because it's easy and we know it's going to be good quality, but it's not because it's good quality that it works for us. And we will not have much of a say what teacher we want to work with, what other students we want to work with, etc. But if we find a teacher we really like, probably the teacher will also attract students that are similar to us. So even if we're in a group, like we'll have a blast. So I really, think the internet probably helps us find teachers who work for us.
And I think that's a very nice circle work around to what we started talking about with personalities and finding or creating almost maybe perhaps a different personality in a different language. And I really like what you started saying here, that you are matching the personality probably mostly of your native language, and then once you speak the language to a more fluent level, then you can find maybe somebody that matches that specific language personality. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what has been your experience with that, with developing, with finding, with creating perhaps your personality in different languages that you speak?
So I think the only two languages that really I can get to the level of feeling maybe some differences in personality could be at the moment English and French, because of the level of mastery. So then I can see with a similar level, of course, my French is better than my English, but with a similar level, are there some changes? And that I found was a very interesting and challenging question. And we mentioned it before. Maybe one day we should have another podcast episode to see if my reflection evolved on that now that I started thinking about it. But before you invited me on this podcast, I had never even thought about that. But what I know already, what I can tell you already, is that there are some tasks. So it's not about personality, but it's about knowing how to perform a task that I know better how to do in French, and some in English, even though I speak English less well than I do French. But that's because I practiced more that specific task in that language. For example, I worked in a startup here in Lithuania, but I worked in English for 3 years. And so I have some business English and copywriting skills. And also, like when I have to develop goals for myself or PRs and things like that, which is not my specialty anyway, but I'm still better or less bad at it in English than I am in French, because I know the vocabulary and just the task brings English to me. And sometimes I try to start writing goals in French, and in the middle of a sentence, I will jump to English and not even notice. So yeah, goal setting for me is English. But like in French, for example, I'm much more comfortable to do creative writing, plays on words, to really have fun with the language. Like English is to be clear for me, and French is to be fun, creative, and playful, because I guess the level of mastery and also just what I did with those languages until now. I participated in a lot of writing workshops in French. I also gave writing workshops in French. So like I've practiced French in a playful way, and I haven't done that so much with English. So that would be a first. Oh, and I wanted to say there are some things that, for example, I was told you should never really try to have therapy in a foreign language, because you will not be able to go as deep and to really connect to your emotions. But because of living abroad most of my life, no, not most of my life yet, but soon, when I had therapy most of the time, it was in English. And yeah, now I'm wondering, was I not able to go as deep? And I'm not sure. I think that in English, I have a lot of vocabulary to speak about emotions, and that actually sometimes I can go deeper than in French, just because I practice. I went to therapy in English, and I barely didn't do that in French.
Like you mentioned when we first started talking, that you also listened to our podcast with Fabio, and he was saying the same thing, that when he talks about football, for example, it's all Italian, but then reading books is all in English, just because from that experience. So that makes a lot of sense. And I do want to comment on what you said with therapy. That's very interesting. I actually read a case study about that a while ago, and they were doing this study on different quote unquote crazy people, and they found that they had exhibited different levels of psychosis in those different languages. That, like you said, somebody that was just insanely crazy in Spanish, when they started speaking English, they were like a normal person, which is insane, because for me, that's always been an assumption of, okay, you know, maybe there's some, you know, rewiring in your brain that makes you act a different way. But it seems that all of a sudden, when you switch a language, you switch your personality, your behavior, your mentality, which was just incredible, because like you said, it's just about that experience that you have with the language, right? That if you've had maybe some trauma or whatever caused that behavior in Spanish, you don't have that in English, and so you can function like a, let's say, quote unquote, again, normal person, which was incredible. And it's interesting that you've had a similar experience.
That is so interesting, because like we keep speaking about how you can rewire your brain, or at least favor some patterns and some paths in the brain by repeating behavior, etc. But it seems that maybe by learning a new language, like, because the places in the brain, the connections that you're using are different. Maybe that can help you do that faster. Maybe trying to create a habit in another language. If you don't manage to create a habit in one language, maybe you can try in another and it will work better. I don't know.
Like you said, with goal setting.
Yes. I cannot do goal settings in French, but maybe in English. And who knows, maybe if I tried in Lithuanian, I would be excellent.
Maybe a good point to try.
Yes, that's very interesting. Yeah, I thought as well how I felt in Lithuanian, because so my level, I would say in Lithuanian depends on the skills, but maybe for speaking, it would be a B1 level. I can get by. I can talk about almost whatever I want, but not at a very deep level. And I will make a lot of mistakes, but I'm fine with it. And then in reading and in listening in more passive activities, I have a B2 level, I would say. This is self-evaluation. I never took tests, but something like that. Like I can read books, I can listen to podcasts, I can listen to conversations. At work, the work in itself was in English, but whenever the conversations were getting personal, they were in Lithuanian. And so, yeah, I could understand a lot. What was difficult is when I wanted to jump into the conversation because my speaking skills were lower. So I was preparing what I wanted to say. And then when I was ready, hop, they had changed the topic at least 3 times. And I was always behind. So I was not participating much. And that was one of the frustrating things. So yeah, in Lithuania, I would say that I tend to be I'm working on that, and I think it's much better now, and we will speak about that when we discuss challenges. But I had a lot of inhibitions, and I felt to be very shy in Lithuanian. And also, I think, and maybe a lot of people listening might identify with that. I've been living in Lithuania for 10 years, and after a while, you kind of expect yourself to have a very good, very high level of the language. And when you didn't reach your expectations, you're a bit disappointed with yourself. You're like, oh, I should not have, and this and that, and you judge yourself. And that actually is a very bad idea because it makes you less likely to continue improving. So I got a stage, I think maybe when I had been there for 6-7 years, I was like, at the beginning, I was not shy speaking at all. And I was actually thinking I was doing great progress and I was proud of myself. And then I kind of hit a wall and didn't continue progressing and didn't invest much time in learning and improving either, because I was doing other things. And so I stayed on that plateau. And then I was disappointed with myself, and speaking Lithuanian felt frustrating. I felt both shy and angry. So emotions that were not super comfortable. So I didn't want to sit with them. So I was avoiding Lithuanian. So I was not improving, etc. So now I would say it's better, and we'll probably discuss that again. But yeah, it's still a language where I feel that I cannot share my whole personality. And it's not so much that I feel like I'm a different person, even though, yes, I'm less able to jump into a conversation as I would in other languages, in French, Spanish, English. I can jump into the conversation, and I know that for some people that's difficult even in their native language. So that would be maybe part of my personality, and I can't express that part of my personality in Lithuanian. I can't make that many jokes and things like that. So there are aspects of my personality but I don't feel that I'm changing personality, just that I cannot express everything in that language. That's the state of my reflection for now, but we can discuss in a few years and see if I have more points. And I was really curious because you definitely have a lot to say about that. And what is your experience? Do you feel like you have different personalities in Polish and in English?
I do. And I think this comes from, like you said, having a rather similar level in both of them, because I definitely can relate to what you're talking about with Lithuanian, with my very basic Spanish, that I can understand some things, I can say some things, but and like you said, it's not really that I'm a different person, I just can't really say that much, and so it very much limits your expression. But in terms of English and Polish, I do definitely feel like I'm a different person. I feel like I very much embody the stereotypes almost of both of these languages, because I feel like in English I'm very outgoing and laughing and smiling and, like I said, making jokes and extroverted and so on, versus in Polish I'm much more reserved, and I notice even my facial expressions change, and how I look at people and how I think changes, and how I react to certain situations changes when I'm speaking Polish versus English, which, like you said, I didn't really notice at the very beginning. It was something that I started noticing, especially with switching, because I talked to my family in Polish, but then my friends in English, now, of course, working with people from all over the world in English. And I noticed, especially with those quick switches that I've been doing, that, oh, that's not the same. That felt a little bit different. So that was my first really with that switching experience, and I do see that very much, and I am very conscious of it now, and it's something that I'm more in control of, I would say, than I was at the very beginning, because at first it was okay, in Polish I'm this person, and in English I'm this person. And now I've been trying to balance them out to create more of a unison between them, because it also feels a little bit strange, kind of like a multiple personality disorder. Like, why am I so different? So I've been trying to marry them a little bit more recently, but it has been a very interesting experience of becoming aware of it. Like you said, that you never really thought about it. And I think that now that you are thinking about it, you're going to see it much more. I'm sure that even if we talk in a month or two, you're going to tell me something completely different than you are now. So definitely have noticed very big differences.
Oh, that leads to another question. I'm becoming the interviewer. Is there anyone or multiple people you sometimes speak Polish to and sometimes English, the same person?
Yes, not very many, but yes, predominantly my husband. Sometimes we speak in Polish, sometimes we speak in English, but also with a few of my students, because some of them are from Poland and sometimes they're not at a very advanced level in English. And so when I have to explain some grammar, or maybe they're not sure about some good vocabulary, then we switch to Polish, and then I explain it to them in Polish, and then we switch back to English. I also have a student now. She is Ukrainian, but she lives in Poland. And so sometimes we have English lessons, sometimes we have Polish lessons. So it's also a little bit of a mix in my brain of, am I supposed to, be this kind of person, or am I this kind of person? And so it does get a little bit confusing, but I do also notice myself being very much of a mirror, that whoever it is that I'm talking to, I get those vibes, and I seem to match them, or at least it seems to be happening more automatically. And so I think that really helps, that if I can see that, like with you, for example, you're very smiley, you're very bubbly, you're very excited, and so am I because of that. Versus if I'm speaking to somebody that's very quiet and very calm, then, I'm not going to start shouting all of a sudden, but just, matching the vibes that we have.
And with those, I think they're very interesting points here. Like with those people, like your husband, you can speak one language or the other. Do you notice that you also switch personality, or is it more related to the person in front of you? With that person, you show one aspect of your personality because they're the way they are, or because you see them in a specific way, or do you change because of the language? Is it internal or is it external, basically?
I would say a little bit of both. It definitely depends on the person. Like you said, if it's somebody that I don't know very well, then I would say it's more internal, because it's kind of my own preconception, let's say, or my own biases potentially related to the language. Versus if it's, like you said, my husband or maybe family members or friends, then it's more so related to the experiences that we've had together, and more so our relationship rather than the language itself. So I would say that it depends on who it is.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I would potentially continue talking about that for ages, but maybe listeners do not want us to continue this conversation for the rest of the podcast. So we can continue offline.
Certainly. Well, I did want to also touch on something that we talked about last time, and something that I found very fascinating, because I asked you about stepping outside of your comfort zone. And you said that you have a very different aspect, or a very different maybe point of view on that. Can you share that with anybody listening?
Yeah, it's not so much that I do not like the idea of stepping out of my or someone else's comfort zone. I actually think it's very fun for me. It's something that most of the time is very fun. But I think you have to be careful. We are in a culture right now that gives a lot of value to stepping out of your comfort zone. And you give that, it's almost an injunction, like all the time, step out of your comfort zone. But I think there are periods in your life that are great for that and periods that are not. And there are things that are great for stepping out of your comfort zone and things that are not. And so you should not, in my opinion, like I'm now saying should not, that is not the right vocabulary. I'm giving another injunction. But what I mean is be very mindful what you step out of your comfort zone for. Think about it. Make sure it's something that you want and not that someone or society tells you should want. And an expression that personally speaks more to me than instead of stepping out of the comfort zone is expanding your comfort zone. So basically you're staying inside of it, but you're pushing its walls further away. You're making it more spacious for yourself. Instead of just going over a fence into the unknown. I think that is a safer approach. Like when I think of that image, I feel comfortable and excited at the same time. For me, there is not that notion of fear that can go with the idea of stepping out of the comfort zone. And sometimes I shared with you that illustration that maybe you can share with our listeners here, that this little ice cube that is in the in the fridge and saying, oh, I have to step out of my comfort zone, and stepping out of the fridge and melting. And yeah, sometimes your comfort zone is where you should live. Just make it bigger.
And that's a really wonderful way of thinking about it, because it's not as scary and it's not as intimidating that, like you said, you're basically jumping the fence into the woods and maybe monsters are lurking there and so on. But you can just expand your fence and make your property a little bit bigger.
Oh, that's such a beautiful
That
way of
makes
saying it.
a whole lot more sense. Certainly, certainly. And can you give us any specific examples of something that you've faced, whether language related, whether work related, or anything else that you've experienced in your life that you were very conscious of? Maybe not necessarily, like you said, stepping out of it, but simply expanding it.
Mm-hmm. So one idea that I think is key, at least for me, is to make it gradually. So that idea of baby steps that you use a lot in coaching. So don't take a leap. Just take baby steps. So you cannot expand your comfort zone very fast. So you push against it little by little. So I spoke before about fun, which for me is super, super important, fun and pleasure in learning. So for example, I said at some point I felt uncomfortable with my level of Lithuanian, and that would prevent me from speaking. And so it was a vicious circle. So one way of expanding my comfort zone was every time I get the chance to speak with someone I don't know for a short interaction, so in a bar, at a restaurant, in the kiosk, but in the street, every time I see an opportunity, I see it exactly like that. In my brain, I name it opportunity, fun opportunity, way to challenge myself in a cute, fun way. I will be able to be proud of myself afterwards. I will, if I have an opportunity to speak, then I do it, but with very little things. And one thing I lead a book club here in Vilnius, and once a month I have to find a place where to have the book club, and so I have to book that place. And I am someone who really doesn't like talking on the phone, and talking on the phone in Lithuanian is even worse. And so I do it every month, but as a little game. I prep myself thinking, okay, afterwards, I try to remember how I felt the previous time. I will feel like that. I will have another tick, one more month that I did it. And usually like the people are very nice with me when I speak Lithuanian. So it in itself, it's not a painful experience. It's just, I make it painful. And I try to remember the little joys in it, or the little, the sense of accomplishment, I think. And the fun and rephrasing things as an opportunity.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful way of thinking about it. Like you said, that it's trying to remember why this is a negative experience in the first place. Is it because it's actually negative? Like you said, are people rude to you? Do they laugh at you? Or is it just your brain lying to you saying, oh no, don't do this, stop doing this? I think you're lying.
Yeah, and yeah, what I think is very key. We mentioned that offline before, but like even when people are laughing, our brain may tell us, "Oh, they're being mean," but actually, most of the time, if people are laughing, it's just because they are amused. And what I've been trying to rephrase it into for me is when I say I make a mistake in Lithuanian, most of the time people don't tell me anything. If I make a mistake, either they don't notice it or they notice it, but it's not important. They understand what I mean, and that's fine. But sometimes I will say something like I will use a word instead of another, and either they will not understand or it will be funny and they will laugh. And so I try to connect with them on the laugh. I ask, can you explain what I said that was funny? And then I actually use that story with students, with to make new friends. All my funny mistakes in Lithuanian, when I asked if it was possible to become pregnant in front of the bank, for example, instead of, is it possible to stop in front of the bank? Things like that. Like I made very funny and weird mistakes in Lithuanian. And so now when I meet someone new, I can tell that story as an icebreaker and laugh about it. And because there is laughter and positive vibes, I also remember very well the difference between sustoti and pastoti in Lithuanian. It's just one little prefix, but it makes a big difference. And if you find the fun in it, it's good.
And I want to stick around with what you said with the icebreakers. Can you walk me through that? And perhaps for anybody listening that is in the same boat of maybe not speaking the language very well, maybe being afraid of starting a conversation, what can you recommend?
So really try and find those very small opportunities. As I said, like I'm supposed to have a B1 level, so I should be able, the shoulds again, I should be able to have much longer conversations than ordering food at the restaurant. And I can in some cases, but that's not what I challenge myself on. Like I challenge myself on small things that I try to make almost a daily or regular practice. So yes, try to speak to people, try to go to shops and to small shops more than supermarkets, because in supermarkets you will not have that much of opportunity of talking. I remember when I was in Poland during my 10 years in Lithuania, I actually had 1 year in Poland, and I was always going to small shops, and my Polish was at such a low level, and I still was able to get what I wanted because I was still at that level where I didn't have any shoulds in my mind. So I was not shy at all, and asking and pointing, use your body as well. Think that the main goal is to be understood, not to make a perfect sentence. Be as communicative in as many ways as possible. And yeah, as long as people understand you, if you drew, if you moved your body, if you laughed, it's not that important. Whatever you did to get to the point of being understood is not the point. The point is being understood. So you can even make a fool of yourself and have a blast. And yeah, fun, gamify things.
I would say that's a very good point, and I believe that many people get stuck with that, and that's something that I walk people through very often as well. That, like you said, it's not really about not making any mistakes and being absolutely perfect, because what is perfection, and so on and so on. But like you said, why are you speaking? Well, is it to say something nice, or is it to ask for that nice cup that you want to buy? So looking for the purpose of your communication in the first place. And I've had the same experience here being in Greece for a few months, and it's most people speak English. I will definitely give them that it's been quite easy just with English, but sometimes when they don't, it's like this, or trying to Google Translate and so on. So it works. Whatever you need to do, it works.
Oh God, I went to Georgia a year ago, and I speak almost no Russian and definitely no Georgian. So I had learned the word to say hello and goodbye in Georgian, but I was really struggling with more than that. So my Russian was a little bit better, but really, really little. And so I was so creative. I was so surprised to discover how creative I had to be to buy a bus ticket, to exchange money. I had at some point a 100 euro bill that I wanted to change, but I didn't want to change the whole money. And so to explain the word half, which I didn't know in Russian, like I was miming cutting the thing in two, and the woman, she understood. And we were even laughing together. And I think another advice that is coming listening to you is like try to connect with the person. So the communication is the fact that the person understands you is the goal of communication. But for me, there's always a level of connecting with the person, and that helps also the person understand you better because their attitude towards you also opens up. So I like being very smiley, laughing when I misunderstand something, and usually the person mirrors that, as you mentioned before, and we can get to laughing or smiling, and that helps the communication and the meaning to pass.
And would you say, and this is related to something that I wanted to ask you, and I think you led very nicely into that. I've been wondering if speaking so many languages and having had experience living abroad and going abroad, even if not living there, but maybe just as traveling, has that made you a better communicator, would you say? Are you able to become a better conversationalist as a result of all of these experiences that you've had?
That's a very good question. Yeah, very good question. It's again, not again, because we didn't mention that, but I would say it's the egg or the chicken. What came first? I don't know if I was drawn to traveling, to learning languages because I enjoyed communicating and entering in, finding new ways of communicating, or if I developed those skills because I traveled, and probably it's a bit of both, but I don't know what prompted it. But definitely I can say there's something for me that is extremely fun in getting to a new place where you don't know the language and communicating there when you don't have any expectations about yourself in that language and you're just experimenting. For me, that is the most fun part. And so I guess that's a way for me to develop that competence, but also to express that competence and the skill that I already have. So expanding that competence, that skill, just like you do with the comfort zone.
Definitely. And that also leads me to one last question that I wanted to ask you, and something that you also alluded to before with some misconceptions and some myths that you have been debunking on your teaching journey, but also maybe within yourself. What have been the biggest maybe misconceptions that you've had, even for yourself, that you've realized were actually wrong?
And the one for myself, I will have to think more about that. But I thought of two that I worked a lot on debunking with students or just people I speak to about French. Like French has the reputation of being a hard language, and yeah, I find it fun and entertaining to prove people wrong. And it's a little bit the same with grammar. Grammar has that reputation of being the opposite of fun, and I like fun, so I like to find ways to make grammar fun for the person, but like also to approach it in a different way. It doesn't have to be difficult, and as I said before, like you can investigate the language and the grammar. So for me, grammar and French, the reputation of them being hard, like what does hard mean? How can you break them into things that make sense to you and that are interesting to you and also that are useful to you? Because I think if you want to learn everything about French or everything about grammar, then you're learning about the language, but you're not able to practice. If your goal is to know about the language, then that's fine, and you can learn as much grammar or as many difficult stuff about French and exceptions, etc., as you want, and you will be very proud of the library of exceptions you have in your brain. But are those exceptions useful in your everyday life? Do you really need to learn all the exceptions to the rules, or even to all the rules? So I have this approach of only coming to a grammar point or a learning point when it appears in conversation, in an authentic conversation. So we'll always start with having a conversation, and then what emerges from that conversation is the basis for learning. And we will never learn all the exceptions to the rules, but the exceptions that are relevant for you personally because of the topics you're interested in, the tasks you may have to do in that language, or the level you have. Some exceptions will come just later on, and I'm never like bringing everything together at the beginning. And then little by little, when you have learned a lot of things that don't seem related, then you relate them to create the link between them. You start seeing the connections, and to basically de-zoom. Sometimes you zoom in and you don't see all the system and all the exceptions, and little by little you zoom out and you start seeing the big picture. But don't start, or sometimes you can introduce the big picture at the beginning. For example, with cases, you may in a language, the conjugation of nouns and adverbs at the beginning, when a learner doesn't know anything about that, maybe you can say what cases are and what they're used for, but don't enter into the details just yet. And then when they need to use one, practice, explain that, then practice another one. And then you can zoom out and see, oh, you already know 2 cases. Congratulations, you didn't know you knew so much. So something like that.
It's kind of like that story that you were telling us before with the student that you had, that he just suddenly said a sentence in French, and he's like, how did that happen? That's that zooming out picture, definitely. Yeah. And I would say that's a very good piece of advice. Is there any other piece of wisdom that maybe we didn't touch on, something that you would like to share?
Build on what you know.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, make connections with what you know, and find also what's different. As we mentioned, like with me learning Turkish and assuming that, oh, since that's the same, then everything about that has to be the same. No, and learn differences, but that's also building on what you know. You know what is in another language, or what is, and you can say, okay, here, difference. And you classify things instead of just trying to learn things in separate bubbles. And like for me, it's a very good idea to compare languages. Not everyone, I think it's possible to learn a language without ever comparing it to another one, and some people can do that, and it's very fine. But for me, it's very fun to understand how each of the languages I'm learning works, and then to compare it. What is similar with that other language I know? And that helps me create long-lasting memories, to have better understanding, and to remember it for longer. Yeah, so that would be good advice. And also, I would say songs and advertisement in the target language are very, very useful ways to practice speaking, because, well, they're the melody and the rhythm, and in ads they use that for the slogans, for example, so that you will remember the slogan very well. So that's short, that's rhythmical, and that's melodic, and so it's very easy to learn it by heart and then repeat it at the same time as the native speaker in the song. You sing together, you sing along, or in the ad. And then you will learn a lot about pronunciation, prosody, so the rhythm of the language. And yes, not always making your own sentences, but also using sentences that are already created to sound good and repeating them along with a native speaker. Like, you can find that on YouTube. So for free is a very, very useful.
And then you're a walking advertisement, just yelling out slogans on the street.
Yes,
Very nice. Very good. Very good piece of advice. I've heard about the songs and not something that I use myself, but with the advertisements, that's a very interesting point. Good tip.
Yeah, I still remember the tagline of a shop in Croatia. I'm almost sure, well, it was like 15 years ago, so I could be making mistake, but I think it was some kroz život, with you across life, something like that. So you see, it's stuck. It's stuck with me. I can't get rid of it. So maybe it's not perfectly right anymore, but you can really, and songs, I remember songs I learned when I was 12 in English, and sometimes I didn't even understand the lyrics back then, and then I sing the song and I'm like, oh, now I understand.
That's what that was about. Yeah. I've had the same experience and I always laugh at myself that oh, that's what they were singing about. Really? Is that what that was? No, definitely. Perfect, perfect. And Caroline, for anybody listening, where can people find you if they want to listen to more of your wisdom, more of your podcast?
So I'm on Facebook at, I never said that in English, but C c'est quoi? So it means what's that in French? And the way I spell it is CQUOI, and then my name, Caroline. So if you look for this on Facebook and on Instagram, you will find my profile, and I'm Caroline Goldie on LinkedIn. I do not post a lot there yet, but I might. And you can definitely contact with me. I check my DMs.
Well, we'll keep an eye out on some more content from you. And other than that, it was an absolute pleasure. Caroline, thank you very much for sharing all of your thoughts and all of your wisdom with us today. I think you shared some really, really interesting pieces of advice. So I'm sure that anybody listening has learned a lot today.
Thank you, Marty, for inviting me.
Hey, I'm glad to see you here. Let me know what you most enjoyed about this conversation, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. Do zobaczenia.